Greetings and welcome to the Homeless Consultant channel. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant. And yes, I am back, and better than ever. This video is entitled The Total Failure of Minnesota Leadership. And it should be quite a brief video because that's how easy it is to demonstrate the total failure of Minnesota leadership. Since I've been away from the video making business for a couple months, I'd just like to recap real quickly what the main points of the Homeless Consultant channel are. When I first started the channel, it was to do a business series called How Not to Do Business. And this was based on my experience at a truck wash where I worked, which was the only job I could get while I was homeless in the state of Minnesota. I'm very proud of that series, and I do hope if you have an interest in business that you will watch it. However, as the homeless issue became more and more urgent for me, the focus of the YouTube channel here turned more toward homeless issues. And with that, I have some other themes that came up repeatedly. The first one would be that Minnesota government is negligent, incompetent, and corrupt. The second one is that Minnesota government is comprised of, let me get a drum roll here, I'm not warmed up, but Minnesota government is comprised of Minnesotans. Who knew? With that, I refer you back to number one. Minnesota government, comprised of Minnesotans, is negligent, incompetent, and corrupt. Minnesota government is appointed and elected representatives of the people of Minnesota. The people of Minnesota elect and appoint these people who are negligent, incompetent, and corrupt to represent their values and ideals and their character. Furthermore, Minnesota government's negligence, incompetence, and corruption is what made me homeless in the first place. Likewise, Minnesota's overall negligence, incompetence, and corruption is precisely what kept me homeless for 2 years. Publicly funded agencies that help the poor and the homeless are useless, counterproductive, and potentially deadly. Many of the employees in these agencies, government employees, just don't care. They are apathetic, they could care less, they are rude, sometimes outright vicious. Their only goal seems to be to preserve their own jobs, and on whole, they don't seem to care much about work either. The main thing they're concerned with is collecting a paycheck, preferably without working. If they have to work, they might do something to try to justify that paycheck. This is not, of course, all government employees. I'm not going to paint with that broad of a brush, but in my dealings, that is what I encountered for the most part. Privately funded agencies, similarly, nonprofit organizations and such, particularly with 501c3 tax-exempt status, are useless, counterproductive, and potentially deadly to the homeless. Again, painting with a bit of a broad brush there. It's not to say there aren't good-hearted people who care in those organizations, but they lack leadership, and that's what this video is going to be about. The Minnesota church is an apostate church. It has fallen so far away from the Bible, from the mandates of the religion that they claim to adhere to, that they claim tax-exempt status on the basis of their adherence to. They have fallen so far away from it that as a Christian myself, it's very difficult for me to call these Christian churches. I approached more than 140, possibly more than 150 churches, and they just plain did not help. All they did was refer me to the aforementioned publicly funded and privately funded agencies, which are, I'll remind you, useless, counterproductive, and potentially deadly to the homeless. The Minnesota news media is corrupt to the core. It protects Minnesota government at all costs. It protects this left-wing socialist dominance in Minnesota at all costs. And if people have to die off camera so that nobody ever finds out about it, they couldn't care less. The housed people out there in the suburbs, in the apartments, in the homes, in the apartments, trailer parks, they are the real threat, not the homeless. Homeless people are probably the least of your worries in terms of a threat. And my videos document time and time and time again about how I am constantly under threat living in a car because of housed people. It is illegal for the homeless to participate in society, and yet society blames the homeless for not participating in society. Specifically, it is illegal for the homeless to complete mandatory paperwork, the kind of paperwork you would need, for instance, to get out of being homeless, for example. Employment applications, automobile registration, license plate renewal, voter's registration, tax forms if you were to somehow get a job, and filing tax returns. All of that is illegal. There's a box up there after your name that says permanent resident address. If you put any other address in there, at the bottom it says, I certify that all information is true and correct, under penalty of perjury, a felony. So any moral homeless person literally cannot, without committing a felony and violating the 10 Commandments, cannot get out of homelessness in the state of Minnesota. I'll also refer you to a couple of relevant and important videos. The How Not to Do Business series I told you about a moment ago. The video called osteichthyphobia, that is the term that I am proposing as a legal term for the fear, loathing, and hatred of the homeless, which leads to unchecked, rampant discrimination, violence against the homeless. Please check out all videos with the word shelter in the title. Those regard my experiences with the shelter system out here. Please view them in order as well. I kept everything intact so that you could see what the progress was for me and how my state of mind changed as I went through those. Self-serving homeless advocates. I hope you will watch that video, if for no other reason because it's a great introduction to propaganda analysis and critical thinking. A couple of things that Minnesota public schools do not teach. Summary for Attorneys is a good summary of my story and how it relates to all the videos on this channel. Let's talk about drugs. The elephant in the room. Drugs plays a huge role in all of this. Not just because homeless people are drug addicts. I've never used drugs in my life. But unfortunately, a lot of the people out there who we count on to save our lives are involved in one way or another with legal or illegal drugs. And yes, that goes up into the city of St. Paul, the capital city of Minnesota. And lastly, a video called Letter to the Midwest Journalism Conference. That's kind of what this video is going to expand upon. In that very brief video, I wrote a letter to the Midwest Journalism Conference asking them to ask the Minnesota press to explain themselves for their complete and utter failure to report my story and stories that are similar. The way that so much money is being wasted without helping the homeless. Full of sound and fury, putting out a story every once in a while to make it look like they're success stories while people are suffering and dying. 10,000 homeless people in the state of Minnesota, no matter how much money's thrown at it, always 10,000 homeless people. The only people profiting from it are the administrators of these programs. Meanwhile, the homeless have more than two times the mortality rate. So again, this video is going to expand upon that video. In that video, when I asked the Midwest Journalism Conference 3 questions. One of those questions is, if you are investigative journalists, why don't you, and why didn't you, on your own volition, why didn't you think of this? Say with me, someone who is sane, sober, hardworking, well-educated, moral, ethical. Why didn't you put me up in a hotel where I could claim some kind of permanent resident address, rent me a car that actually functions, unlike the car that has been destroyed all around me as I've lived in it for 2 years and is now totally unreliable. And, maybe a little bit of cash or what have you, but why didn't you just set me up and see what happens? And my proposal was that if they had done that, they would see what happens, which is that I would quickly get back my professional career. And then, when they compare the amount of money that they spent on that experiment versus what the state of Minnesota is sucking out of people's tax dollars and throwing at this problem, again, always with 10,000 homeless people, because it doesn't work, they would find that the amount of money they spent on me by tailoring the response to what I needed is far, far, far less than what the state of Minnesota spends to accomplish nothing. With that in mind, I want to inform you that as of April 3rd, a very kind and wonderful family took me into their home and gave me a room to stay in. They did exactly what I've been asking the state of Minnesota to do for me all along, which is to make it legal for me to get a job. Now, I never asked the state of Minnesota to give me housing. I asked for them to let me get a job. For example, passing legislation that prohibits all of this paperwork from demanding that we commit a felony if we don't have a permanent resident address. Then I could have looked for a job while I was still living in my car. Providing some means of maintaining your hygiene instead of spending all that money on a football stadium for a privately owned football team. But the Minnesota legislature had no interest in that. They did nothing. This wonderful family, when they heard about my story on April 3rd, they took me into their home. Now, I want to tell you what the difference that makes, because that's going to illustrate and demonstrate beyond any question whatsoever the total failure of Minnesota leadership. Before this family took me in, my life consisted basically of 4 things. Sitting in this car 24 hours a day, moving my car from here to there to avoid problems with the police or those people who live in houses that you're not afraid of but you should be afraid of. You're afraid of homeless people instead. Trying to get help from people who won't help, and selling off my possessions to pay for gas and food for each day. That's how my life was spent. Immediately upon receiving that permanent address where they just gave me a room to sleep in, the next day I got my hair cut and I started working on my resume, and I got to know this family. Within a few days I was out there getting interviews, handing out the resume, emailing the resume all over the place. 10 days later, I had, I don't know how many interviews I had before that, but I had a job interview 10 days later, which resulted 1 week later in a job offer. A professional job that's right up my alley. Now, with that job, it did not start for an additional 3 weeks, but I've already started. I've been working there for about a month, and I'm making money at professional work. On April 2nd, I was sitting in my car 24 hours a day, moving my car around to avoid harassment from the police or violence from people out there. I was trying to get help from people who would not help, Minnesota leadership, and I was selling off all my possessions for gas and food. There really isn't much more to say. I could detail you on a point-by-point basis. My journal, if you look at my journal, it basically, for what it's worth, it says, sat in car all day, sat in car all day, sat in car all day. Because as I lost all my possessions and money, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even go out and ask for help, and nobody helped anyway. On April 3rd, when that family gave me a resident address so that I was no longer committing a felony if I put in a job application, instantly, my days were just chock full, overflowing with activity. Haircut, getting a job, getting the resume, going to temp agencies, doing job interviews, hustling. 10 days later, I have the interview that got me the job. 1 week later, I had the job offer, a good one. 3 weeks later, I was working at the job. I'm there right now, and I'm doing a good job at it. And I like it, and I like the people I work with. You know, there really isn't much else to say. If you compare the before and after, it should be perfectly clear. The total and complete, utter failure of Minnesota leadership. The state legislature, all of these ridiculous publicly funded and privately funded nonprofit organizations that accomplished zero over the last 2 years. The churches, more than 140, probably more than 150, who did zero. All they did was try to send me to the aforementioned useless agencies. One family who hardly has any money themselves, who can hardly get by themselves, took me in because they cared. And look what I did with it. And this is exactly what I asked the Minnesota news media to try as an experiment to demonstrate the incompetence, negligence, and corruption of Minnesota leadership. But the Minnesota news media protects that leadership. The problem is, unfortunately for them, some family did the experiment for them. And I'm giving you the results. Folks, there's nothing more to say. When I got the simple thing I asked for, which hardly cost anybody any money whatsoever, I'm back to professional work again. I still have to get a place to live, but that's coming soon. This is the total and complete failure of Minnesota leadership, from bottom to top. And now that I'm back, and now that I have my camera out of the pawn shop, I'm going to spend some time talking about that. And I hope you'll come back to hear me talk about that. Thank you very much for watching this video.